the difference between the composition of God and the difference between the composition of himself as opposed to God. In short, if man knew, or that if it were revealed to you, God's composition, you would have that knowledge. Having that knowledge and already knowing the composition of man, you would then know the distinction between the composition of God and the composition of man. Or you would know how much like the composition of God is the composition of man. Or you would know the difference between the composition of God and the composition of man. If you knew the composition of God, you already know that the composition of man is flesh. The composition of man is blood. What is the composition of God? Is the composition of God flesh? Is the composition of God blood? If it isn't, then he's most unlike man. Then man would not be God. But if the composition of God is flesh or is blood, then God's composition is the same as man's. And if God's composition is the same as man's, then man can be God, or God can be man. But since the Bible does not say that God's composition is flesh and blood, and no man before this has ever said that God's composition is flesh and blood. It has been declared, however, by Jesus of 2,000 years ago that God is man. It has been declared, however, by our Savior, Master Silis Muhammad, that God is man. It has been declared by the Honorable Elijah Muhammad that God is man. But what is the composition of God? All the prophets before say that the composition of God is spirit and is not flesh and blood. If the composition of God is spirit, then God is spirit. Then if God is spirit and is not flesh and blood, then God would not be flesh and blood. But let us not stop there. That's the argument of the Christians and of the Orthodox Muslims. Man is flesh and blood. Without doubt, he is flesh and blood. But is not man also spirit?
Yes, sir.
The extent to which man is also spirit, then man has the same composition as God.
Yes, sir.
Therefore, man is God.
Yes, sir.
Assalamu alaikum. The composition of God. A subtopic that I want to point out to you concerning the composition of God is, are you man? Are you not also spirit? In addition to being flesh and blood. Last week, we pointed out that it's possible for a man to know the composition of God in so much as God does give to man revelations. And if God would reveal his composition to man or you, then you would know the composition of God. And now your knowledge of the composition of God and your knowledge of the composition of man would allow you to see how much like the composition of God is the composition of man, or how much like the composition of man is the composition of God, or the difference between the composition of God and the composition of man. This age
age-old question that has plagued the earth for a number of years, many, many trillions of years. Who is God? Where is God? Between 1930 and 1975, we sought to prove to you that man is God. Man is Allah. But it was insisted that God is spirit by the opponents, and he is not man. Let us turn the statement a bit, rather than try and prove that God is man. Let us show you that man is spirit. There are some who would contend with you even on that question, that man is also spirit, in addition to being flesh and blood. We have no question about God, whether God is flesh and blood, or whether God is spirit. That no longer is a question in the minds of the opponents and yourselves. The question really is whether man is God. And that question can be resolved by those who are thinking. And the answer to the question is man not also spirit, in addition to being flesh and blood? Excuse me for a few moments. This is a very important subject to me. This is where my real work is bringing in a new world. And that new world cannot come into being except that there comes about a new man. So in essence, what we are doing here today is creating a new man and a new woman, ushering in a new world. It is a very serious work. It's a very serious business. Unlike going to church to hear spiritual teachings so that you might leave afterwards feeling good and have spirit enough to carry you the next week, that you'd be rejuvenated or regenerated with a new spirit. Here, our attempt is to create in you a new man, a new woman. And the hour fast approaches when you will see all of these things come to pass. I've spoken to you in advance about there being two worlds. I've spoken to you concerning another world, existing here now. I try to draw you an approach near to that world that you might see it and know that it exists. A new world and its creation. Sometimes it's referred to as the new heaven and the new earth. This is of extreme importance. Some of you are concerned, why keep talking the business about God? Why keep talking the business about a new heaven, a new earth? Why not be content with life as it is? Life is not content as it is. A new world must come. A new heaven must come.